There is a moment when the entire universe holds its breath, and that moment came the day the Velarath Empire sent a message to every living civilization in the galaxy. Not an invitation, not a warning, an ultimatum. The year was 2387. Humanity had long since broken free from the cradle of Earth, the Moon, Mars, Europa, Kepler Station, the colonies stretching across 4 star systems. These were not just outposts anymore. They were homes. They were families. They were 300 years of blood, sacrifice, and stubborn human willpower carved into the stars. Humanity had done what no one thought possible. It had survived long enough to reach the galaxy. But the galaxy was not empty, and the ones who had been watching humanity from the shadows, they had never once been impressed. Velarath, just a name was enough to silence a room, to empty a planet, to make hardened soldiers go pale. They were not simply an empire. They were a fact of the universe. A 50,000-year-old civilization whose warships dwarfed humanity's finest vessels like mountains over matchsticks. Their technology was so advanced that human physics textbooks read like children's finger paintings to their scientists. Their fleet had already swallowed 14 civilizations whole. Not through war, but through fear alone. Those civilizations had surrendered before a single shot was fired, because they knew, everyone knew, you do not fight the Velarath. You kneel, or you cease to exist. And now, their eyes had turned toward a small, loud, chaotic species on the edge of the galaxy. Toward us, the message came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Earth Standard Time, 7:42 a.m. Every communication channel across human space, military frequencies, civilian networks, diplomatic bands, went silent simultaneously. And into that silence came a voice, deep, mechanical, so utterly cold that the people who heard it described a physical chill running down their spines. Humanity, you have been observed. You have been measured. You have been found insufficient. Nobody breathed. The Velarath Empire hereby issues its final and only declaration. Surrender your colonies. Surrender your fleets. Surrender your weapons. You have 72 hours to comply. Resistance will be answered with extinction. Then silence. No dialogue. No negotiation. No room for questions. Just a command. Bow down, or be erased. The entire galaxy watched. The Velarath had a perfect record. 14 civilizations, 14 surrenders. Some had capitulated before the message even finished transmitting, because they understood what humanity was only beginning to grasp. This was not a threat. This was a schedule. The Zorgothi Confederacy watched through long-range sensors. The Mun Collective convened emergency councils. The Praetorian Republics went into diplomatic lockdown. Every civilization with eyes on this corner of the galaxy turned those eyes toward one question. What will the humans do? The United Earth Council emergency session convened 4 hours later. 190 nations. One room. One question that no political training had ever prepared anyone to answer. Some argued for surrender. We survived, they said. Our children live. Slavery is not death. We can endure. We can wait. Maybe centuries from now. Some argued for negotiation. Buy time. Find loopholes. Appeal to galactic law. Surely there were other powers who would intervene. The debate was loud, desperate, terrified. And then a chair scraped back from the far end of the table. Admiral Serafina Voss, 61 years old, silver-haired, eyes that had seen things most people could not imagine. She was a survivor of the Kepler Station raids. She had watched with her own eyes what empires do to civilizations that surrender peacefully. She had held the hands of people who had nothing left. She stood up. The room went quiet without anyone asking it to. And she said just one thing. We are human. We do not know how to live on our knees. And that was the moment everything changed. 72 hours later, when the Velarath Empire waited for its answer, there was no surrender, no white flag, no desperate plea broadcast across the stars. What they received instead was a transmission, galaxy-wide, live feed, unencrypted, so that every civilization watching could see it in perfect clarity. Admiral Voss stood at the podium of the United Earth Council chamber, straight-backed, chin raised, eyes carrying the weight of 8 billion people and the fire of every human who had ever been told they were not enough. She looked directly into the camera, and she said 2 words. Come then. Silence detonated across the galaxy like a shockwave. Zorgothi diplomats pulled up historical records in disbelief. Was this species simply suicidal? The Mun Collective's finest strategic analysts called emergency sessions trying to model what they were witnessing. 3 minor civilizations in the Outer Rim reportedly began prayers on humanity's behalf. Not because they believed humans could win, but because they wanted the universe to witness what came next with some dignity. And the Velarath Emperor, for the first time in recorded history, paused. He had consumed 14 civilizations. He had never once been looked in the eye. Not like this. Not ever. The galaxy had expected humanity to fold. The galaxy did not know what humanity had been doing quietly, in the dark, in the space between stars, for the last 40 years. The Velarath thought this war would be over in 72 hours. They had no idea. They had just kicked open a door that had been waiting for decades to be opened. If this part gave you chills, drop HFY in the comments right now. They came without warning. Not that a warning would have mattered. When the Velarath moved, they did not announce themselves. They did not posture. They did not give humanity the dignity of watching them approach on long-range scanners and preparing defenses. They simply arrived, like a storm that skips the clouds entirely and begins as lightning. And the first place that lightning struck was Mars. Red Colony. That was what the settlers called it. Not Mars. Not the official designation. Red Colony. Because that was what had become over 2 centuries of human stubbornness. A colony of 4.2 million people carved into rust-red rock and thin atmosphere by sheer refusal to accept that humans did not belong there. Children had been born on Mars who had never seen Earth, who had grown up under a pale, distant sun and learned to love it anyway, who had built schools and markets and hospitals inside domed cities that glittered against a Martian night like scattered diamonds. Those children were asleep when the Velarath fleet dropped out of FDL orbit directly above the planet. 4:17 a.m. Mars Standard Time, the orbital defense grid responded in 11 seconds. Humanity's finest automated defense system. Years of engineering, billions in resources, the pride of the Solar Defense Initiative. 11 seconds from detection to full combat activation. It lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes against a Velarath assault fleet was not a battle. It was a demonstration. The kind of demonstration you put on when you want the entire galaxy to understand something very clearly. This is what resistance looks like, and this is what it costs. The orbital platforms fell one by one, each explosion blooming silently against the black of space like dying flowers. The defense grid's final automated distress signal, a cold, mechanical loop of coordinates and threat assessment, transmitted for exactly 38 seconds before it too went dark. And then the Velarath turned their weapons toward the surface. What happened next lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes. That is how long it took the Velarath Empire to reduce everything humanity had built on Mars over 200 years into fire and memory. The domed cities cracked first. Pavonis, Hellas, New Shanghai, Bradbury Station. Names that had meant something. Names that families had written on letters home, that children had traced on maps, that lovers had whispered in the dark. Those names became coordinates in a targeting system. And those coordinates became craters. The last transmission from Red Colony came from a man named Dr. Elias Rourke, atmospheric scientist, father of 3, 44 years old. He had been awake early, running data on a dust storm simulation, when his instruments went haywire and the sky turned white. His final transmission lasted 12 seconds. They're here. God help us. There. Tell Earth we didn't. We didn't surrender. Tell them we didn't. Static. On Earth, it was mid-morning. The feeds came in fragments at first. Garbled sensor data. Broken transmissions. Emergency frequencies lighting up like wildfire. And then the long-range optical telescopes confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Mars was burning. Not metaphorically. Not strategically. Burning. A planet wrapped in a halo of fire and debris. The remnants of 2 centuries of human civilization rising as a slow, Silent column of destruction visible from Earth's surface with a naked eye on a clear night. People stood in streets and stared at it. Some fell to their knees. Some screamed. Some said nothing at all, because there was nothing that language had been built to contain this kind of loss. For 0.2 million people, gone in 17 minutes. The United Earth Council chamber was not the measured political space it had been 72 hours ago. It was grief walking in human clothing, red-eyed, shaking. Some representatives had family on Mars. Some had already received confirmation. Some were still waiting. And the waiting was its own kind of destruction. Admiral Voss stood at the head of the room. She had not slept. The lines on her face looked car deeper than they had been the day before. But her eyes were different now. The fire that had been there before had not gone out. It had changed. It was no longer fire of defiance. It was something colder, more focused, more dangerous. She pulled up a single image on the main screen. A photograph recovered from the last automated backup satellite before the grid went dark. A Martian child drawing, somehow caught in the debris field. Crayon, red and blue and yellow. A crude picture of families standing in front of a domed city, a pale sun above them, and below it an unsteady child handwriting. Home. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Voss turned to face the room. They wanted us to see this, she said. Her voice was quiet. That was almost worse than shouting. They didn't have to hit Mars first. They could have hit our military installations, our shipyards, our command infrastructure. They hit Mars because they wanted 4.2 million deaths broadcast across every screen in the galaxy. They wanted every civilization watching to see what happens when you say no to them. She paused. They wanted us broken. Another pause. Longer. I want you to look at this room. Look at every face in it. And tell me, does anyone here look broken to you? Silence. And then, from the back of the room, a single voice. No, Admiral. Then another. No. And another, until the word was moving through the chamber like a current. Low. Fierce. Building. No. 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 The galaxy watched humanity absorb the destruction of Mars. The analysts predicted what came next. Capitulation, they said. Surely now. Surely after seeing 4.2 million of their own erased in 17 minutes, the humans would understand. Pride was one thing. Extinction was another. The Zorgothi ambassador officially recommended humanity surrender for its own protection. It was, he said, the only logical path. The Mun Collective sent a diplomatic envoy with terms they had negotiated on humanity's behalf with the Velarath, reduced servitude, preserved genetic lines, limited cultural autonomy. They meant it as kindness. Admiral Voss received the Mun envoy personally. She listened to the full proposal, every word, without interrupting, without expression. When the envoy finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at him for a long moment. Go home, she said quietly. And when you get there, tell your people to stay out of our way. The envoy left, and Voss turned to her commanders and said the words that would later be carved into the wall of every military academy humanity would ever build. Mars will be remembered, but it will not be the end of our story. It will be the beginning of theirs. What the galaxy did not know, what even most of humanity did not know, was what happened in the 6 hours following the fall of Mars. Deep in the asteroid belt between Jupiter and Saturn, in a region of space so deliberately cluttered with sensor-scattering debris that no external scanner had ever gotten a clean read on it, something woke up. 40 years of silence. 40 years of construction. 40 years of a secret so carefully kept that fewer than 200 humans alive knew the full scope of it. 40 years of humanity building, not in hope, but in certainty. Certainty that one day, something exactly like this would come, and they would need to be ready. The first ship powered on its drives at 1433 Earth Standard Time, then the second, then 20, then 100. Then the number stopped being something that felt real. In the darkness of the asteroid belt, hidden from every eye in the galaxy, humanity's true answer to the Velarath ultimatum began to move. And it was magnificent, and it was terrible, and the galaxy had absolutely no idea it existed. If this part hit you somewhere deep, Comment from Mars below. Let the world see it. Like this video, if you stand with humanity. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in deep space, not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of nothing, the silence of something enormous, holding perfectly, deliberately still. For 40 years, that silence had lived in the asteroid belt between Jupiter and Saturn. For 40 years, it had breathed in the dark, patient and cold and waiting. For 40 years, every ship, every weapon, every system had sat dormant. Not because it was forgotten, but because the people who built it understood something profound about the nature of survival. The most dangerous weapon in the universe is not the one pointed at your enemy. It is the one your enemy does not know exists. The program had no official name in any public record, no budget line, no congressional approval trail, no press conference, no leak. In the classified files of the United Earth Strategic Command, it was referenced only by a single designation, Project Lazarus, because the entire philosophy behind it was simple. You cannot kill what was never supposed to be alive. It had begun in 2347, 40 years before the Velarath Ultimatum, before most of the people now serving in humanity's military had even been born. A woman named Director Asha Menon, theoretical physicist, strategic analyst, and the most quietly terrifying mind humanity had ever produced, had stood before a council of 7 people in a room with no windows and no recording devices, and said something that changed the course of human history. "We will be found eventually," she had said. "The galaxy is not as empty as we hope. And when we are found, we will not be found by friends. We will be found by something older and larger and more powerful than anything we have ever imagined. And on that day, our survival will depend entirely on what we have done in the time before that day arrives." The council had listened, and then they had done something remarkable. They had trusted her. For 4 decades, in the most remote and deliberately sensor-cluttered region of human space, construction had continued without pause. Ships were built not in orbital dockyards where anyone with a telescope might notice, but in hollowed asteroids, in mobile construction bays that moved constantly, in facilities so deep inside rock and debris that they registered as nothing more than background noise on any scanner in the known galaxy. The engineers who worked there signed contracts that included memory suppression protocols, not forced, voluntary. They understood what they were building and why the secret had a hold. Families were told their loved ones worked in deep space mining operations. And in a way, they did. They were mining the future. The fleet that powered on in the hours after Mars fell was not what anyone would have expected from humanity. It was not a collection of warships in the traditional sense. It was not rows of identical vessels following a standard design doctrine, because Director Menon had understood something crucial about fighting a technologically superior enemy. You do not fight them the way they expect to be fought. You fight them the way they have never been fought before. The Ghost Fleet was built around a single philosophy: unpredictability as a weapon. Every class of vessel had been designed to exploit a specific weakness in Velarath tactical doctrine, weaknesses identified over 40 years of observation, analysis, and reverse engineering of every piece of Velarath technology humanity had ever managed to recover or observe. There were 712 ships in total. Each one had a name, not a designation, not an alphanumeric code. A name: Defiance, Reckoning, Prometheus, Red Colony, for Elias, Never Again. The people who built them had understood that these ships would one day carry the entire weight of humanity's existence. They had named them accordingly. Admiral Serafina Voss stood on the bridge of the flagship, a vessel so large its hull carried the names of every colony humanity had ever lost, etched in letters small enough to read only if you stood close enough to touch them. Its name was Lazarus. Fitting. Voss looked out to the forward viewport at the fleet assembling around her in the dark. 712 ships, running silent, no external lighting, moving to the asteroid belt like ghosts through a graveyard. Her second-in-command, Commander Dalway, appeared at her shoulder. "They have no idea," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement of pure, focused wonder. "No," Voss agreed. "They don't." She paused. Her eyes moved across the darkness where her fleet waited, invisible and ready. "Let's keep it that way a little longer." The Velarath had not moved immediately after Mars. This was deliberate, tactical. The Velarath had not survived 50,000 years of expansion by being impatient. Their commander, Fleet Lord Saravan, a being who had personally overseen the absorption of 6 civilizations and whose name was spoken with reverence throughout the Empire, had given humanity time after Mars. Time to process, time to grieve, time to break. He had seen it before. Every civilization had a breaking point, the destruction of something beloved, a home world, a primary colony, a symbol of everything they had built, was usually enough. The grief became surrender. It always did. He was waiting for the transmission, the white flag, the desperate, tearful capitulation that would end sufficiently and add humanity to the Empire's growing collection of subjugated species. His patience was legendary. What it was not was infinite. After 6 days of silence from humanity, Fleet Lord Vaughn ordered his fleet to advance toward Earth. They never saw the Ghost Fleet coming. That was the point. The Velarath advanced formation, 47 warships moving in their standard offensive configuration, a wedge designed to maximize forward firepower while protecting the fleet's core, crossed into the outer solar system at 3 o'clock Earth Standard Time. Their sensors showed nothing unusual. Asteroid field to port, standard debris scatter to starboard, cosmic background radiation within normal parameters. Nothing. Right up until the moment that 712 ships simultaneously powered their drives, dropped their stealth fields, and lit up the darkness of the asteroid belt like a second sun being born. The Velarath sensor operators had 4.3 seconds of warning. 4.3 seconds to see what had just appeared out of nowhere. 4.3 seconds to process readings that made no tactical sense. 4.3 seconds to transmit a single fragmented burst communication back to Fleet Lorvon that contained only 2 pieces of information, a fleet count and a heading. Fleet Lord Vaughn received that transmission on the bridge of his command vessel. He read it. He read it again. He turned to his tactical officer and said something that, when later translated and broadcast across the galaxy, became perhaps the most significant 6 words ever spoken by a Velarath commander. That is not possible. Recalibrate sensors. The sensors were fine. What happened in the next 4 hours became known in human history as the Battle of the Belt. It was not a clean victory. Humanity had not built the Ghost Fleet to win through superior firepower. They did not have it. What they had built it for was this: the ability to fight in a way the Velarath had never modeled, never prepared for, never even conceived of as a viable tactical doctrine. The Velarath fought in formations. Centuries of successful conquests had refined their fleet tactics into something approaching mathematical perfection. Every ship knew its role. Every maneuver was calculated. Every contingency was pre-modeled and pre-answered. Humanity fought like humans, which is to say, chaotically, emotionally, creatively, and with a complete disregard for what the tactical models said should be possible. Ships that should have retreated accelerated instead. Flanking movements that made no logical sense turned out to be feints concealing ambushes. Vessels that appeared damaged and vulnerable were drawing fire deliberately, because behind them, positioned exactly where the Velarath tactical model said no rational commander would place an asset, something considerably more dangerous was waiting. Within the first hour, 11 Velarath warships were destroyed. The Velarath advance formation had never lost 11 ships in a single engagement in recorded history. Within the second hour, Fleet Lord Vaughn ordered a tactical retreat, another thing the Velarath advance formation had never done. Within the third hour, the Ghost Fleet pursued them. And this was the moment the galaxy understood that something fundamental had shifted, because the Velarath did not retreat. They absorbed. They consumed. They advanced. The concept of a Velarath fleet pulling back from an engagement with a species the Empire had already designated for extinction was so outside the bounds of what any observer had ever seen that the Zorgity Confederacy's lead military analyst reportedly sat in stunned silence for 11 minutes before saying anything at all. What he finally said was, "They're running." Fleet Lord Vaughn was not a being who experienced fear. He had been conditioned against it, trained beyond it. In 50,000 years of Velarath military tradition, fear was not a concept that applied to commanders of his rank. There were tactical reassessments, strategic withdrawals, recalculations of engagement parameters. But what moved through him as he watched his advanced formation fall back from a species he had been briefed would offer token resistance before collapsing? If it was not fear, it was the closest thing to it he had ever felt. And somewhere in the cold, analytical core of his military mind, a question formed that he could not immediately answer. What else don't we know about them? The Ghost Fleet did not pursue beyond the edge of the solar system. Voss called the halt herself. Her commanders had wanted to press the advantage. The momentum was theirs. The psychological impact was maximum. This was the moment to... No, Voss said. We let them go? Dao Wei asked. Voss turned from the viewport. Her expression was not the face of someone who had just won a battle. It was the face of someone executing a plan several moves deeper than the one everyone else could see. We don't let them go, she said quietly. We let them carry a message. She paused. The message that humanity is exactly where we've always been, and we are waiting. The galaxy received that message loudly. Every civilization that had been watching, and they were all watching, understood that something unprecedented had just occurred. A species that the Velarath Empire had given 72 hours to surrender had just driven a Velarath advance fleet into retreat. Not negotiated, not delayed, driven back. The Praetorian Republic sent an unofficial communique to Earth within hours. Not an alliance offer, not yet, but something that had never been extended to humanity before. Respect. But in the silence of his command vessel, Fleet Lord Vaughn was already composing his report to the Emperor. And in that report was a recommendation. No more advanced formations. No more demonstrations. No more patience. The full weight of the Velarath Empire. Every ship, every weapon, every resource, aimed at one target. Because what humanity had just done was not merely a tactical surprise. It was a statement. And the Empire did not allow statements to go unanswered. The response Fleet Lord Vaughn was requesting will be the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the known galaxy. If this part just changed how you see this war, comment Ghost Fleet below. I want to see it. Like this video, if humanity just earned your respect. There are places in history that were never meant to matter. Small places, quiet places, places that existed for years in the background of larger stories, unremarkable and unheroic, doing their jobs without anyone noticing. And then one day, without warning, without ceremony, without anyone asking if they were ready, those places become everything. Kepler Station was one of those places. It sat at the edge of human-controlled space like a comma in a sentence. Small, functional, easy to overlook. Originally constructed as a deep space relay and research hub, it had grown over 70 years into something more complex. A waypoint for colony ships, a refueling station for long-haul freighters, a home, eventually, for a permanent crew of 412 people who had chosen the quiet life of the frontier over the noise and crowds of the inner colonies. Families lived there. Children went to school there. A man named Torres grew tomatoes in a hydroponics bay and argued passionately that they were the best tomatoes in the known galaxy, a claim that no one disputed, partly because the tomatoes were genuinely excellent, and partly because Torres would not stop talking about them until you agreed. It was not a military installation. It had 2 defensive gun platforms, both of which were outdated by 30 years of technological advancement, and a skeleton crew of 18 Earth Defense Force personnel whose primary function was administrative rather than combat. It was not built to hold a line. It was built to exist quietly in the dark, doing its small and necessary job, and let the larger universe move around it. But Kepler Station sat at the mouth of the Kepler Corridor, and the Kepler Corridor was the only viable approach vector through which a fleet of the size of Velarath were assembling could reach Earth in less than 3 weeks. Fleet Lord Vaughn knew this. His navigational projections had identified it within the first hour of planning. The Kepler Corridor was not just a convenient route. It was the only route, if speed was the objective, and after the humiliation of the Belt Retreat. Speed was very much the objective. Take the corridor, reach Earth, end this. There was one obstacle. Kepler Station. It was, by every military metric, not a serious obstacle. 2 outdated gun platforms. 18 defense personnel. No fleet support within viable response range. The Velarath could remove it from the equation with a single-strike cruiser and barely slow their advance. Fleet Lord Vaughn allocated 3 ships to the task. He considered it already done. What changed everything was a single decision made by a single person at 6 o'clock Earth Standard Time, 48 hours before the Velarath fleet was projected to reach the corridor. Captain Yara Osei received her orders at 6 o'clock. Evacuate Kepler Station. Civilian personnel only. Maintain a minimal military presence for as long as tactically viable, then withdraw. She read the orders twice. Then she called her crew together in the main bay, all 412 of them, civilians and defense personnel alike. And she told them the truth, every word of it, the size of the fleet coming, the timeline, the strategic importance of the corridor, what would happen to Earth if the corridor fell quickly, what might be possible if it did not fall quickly. She told them the evacuation transports had capacity for the civilian population and most of the non-essential personnel. She told them she was not ordering anyone to stay. She told them she was staying, and then she stopped talking. What happened next, Yara Osei would describe for the rest of her life as a moment she understood something about humanity that she had always believed but never truly felt in her bones. Nobody left, not one person. Torres set down the tomatoes he had been holding. He had been in the hydroponics bay when the call came, and he had brought them with him out of pure reflex. And he said, very simply, "Tell me where you need me." A 17-year-old girl named Priya, who had been born on Kepler Station and had never in her life been in a combat situation of any kind, walked up to the Defense Force sergeant and said, "Teach me how to use the gun platforms." The station's chief engineer, a quiet, methodical man named Kovacs, who had spent 30 years maintaining systems and had never fired a weapon in his life, spent the next 6 hours converting the station's industrial docking lasers into makeshift weapons emplacements. He had never done it before. He figured it out. Voss received the report from Kepler Station at 9 o'clock. She read it in silence. Then she sat down, something her staff rarely saw her do, and she was quiet for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tactical calculation. "Give me a channel to Captain Osei," she said quietly. The channel opened. "Captain," Voss said, "I have read your station's response to the evacuation order." A pause. "Admiral." Osei's voice came back, calm, steady, carrying the particular quality of a person who has already made peace with a decision and is now simply executing it. "Kepler Station will hold the corridor. Yara," Voss almost never used first names. "You understand what's coming." "Yes, Admiral." 400 people against 3 Velarath warships. Minimum. "Yes, Admiral." The silence stretched. "What do you need?" Voss finally said, and in those 4 words was everything. The grief, the pride, the recognition of what was being offered, and the way of accepting it. 12 hours, Osei said. "Buy us 12 hours of resupply, and we'll hold that corridor long enough to matter." The resupply convoy arrived in 11 hours and 40 minutes. What it carried was not standard military hardware. It carried everything humanity could strip from every available source in the time allowed: additional ammunition, jury-rigged shield emitters, communications equipment, medical supplies, and something that no military requisition form had ever previously included: letters, thousands of them, from Earth, from Mars survivors, from the colonies, from children who had heard on the news that people at a place called Kepler Station were going to stand between them and something terrible. The letters were printed and distributed across the station in the 2 hours before the Velarath arrived. Torres read his in the hydroponics bay, surrounded by his tomato plants. He wept. Then he went back to his weapons station. The Velarath arrived at 1400 hours. Not 3 ships. 7. Fleet Lord Vaughn had reconsidered. After the belt. After what humanity had demonstrated about doing the unexpected. He was taking no chances with the corridor, regardless of what his intelligence said about the station's defensive capability. 7 warships against Kepler Station. The galaxy, watching through long-range sensors, did the math immediately. The consensus was that the station would last minutes. Possibly less. Against 7 Velarath warships. For 100 people in an aging deep space station with improvised weapons and outdated gun platforms had no business surviving the first exchange. The Zorgathy military observer, on record, described it as a gesture, brave but meaningless. The humans at that station are already dead. Kepler Station lasted 9 hours and 47 minutes. 9 hours, 47 minutes, against 7 Velarath warships. It did not hold because of superior technology. It did not hold because of tactical genius alone, though Osei's command decisions under fire would later be studied in military academies across human space for generations. It held because of something the Velarath tactical doctrine had no category for. It held because every single person on that station had decided, individually and collectively, that the lives behind them were worth more than the lives they were living. Torres manned his weapons station for 6 straight hours. When his platform took a direct hit that destroyed its targeting system, he switched to manual fire, a method so imprecise it should have been useless, and still managed to contribute to the destruction of a Velarath strike crafted by a combination of intuition, stubbornness, and what he later described as being very angry. Priya, the 17-year-old who had never fired a weapon before 2 days ago, coordinated shield rotation across 3 damage emitter arrays simultaneously, while the station shook around her, keeping a coverage pattern functional that should mathematically have collapsed after the 3rd hour. Kovacs kept the improvised docking laser emplacements running through sheer mechanical will, crawling through damaged conduits between fire exchanges to make repairs that no engineering manual had ever described because the situation they were in had never existed before. The Velarath commander leading the assault, a decorated officer named Subcommander Reth, made 7 tactical adjustments in the first 3 hours. 7 against a station that should have fallen in minutes. He later reported to Fleet Lord Vaughn that the engagement had been unlike anything in his operational experience. Not because the humans were technologically competitive. They were not, but because they do not respond to damage the way modeled opponents do. When a position becomes untenable, they do not retreat from it. They find a way to make it tenable again. I have never encountered an enemy that treats every setback as a problem to be solved rather than a signal to withdraw. It is deeply irrational, and it is extremely difficult to fight. At hour 7, Kepler Station lost primary power. At hour 8, 2 of the gun platforms were destroyed. At hour 9, Captain Osei took a console explosion to her left side and was pulled from the command deck by her first officer, refusing to be taken to the medical bay until she had given her final orders. At hour 9 and 47 minutes, the station fell, but the corridor had held long enough. The Ghost Fleet, repositioned in the hours Kepler Station had bought with everything it had, was now in place. The approach the Velarath had planned, the overwhelming advance they had designed to reach Earth in under 3 weeks, was no longer viable. Fleet Lord Vaughn received the navigational report and understood immediately what had happened. A station full of civilians and 18 defense personnel had just cost him his entire strategic timeline. He sat with that knowledge for a very long time. Of the 412 people on Kepler Station, 289 survived. They were recovered by search and rescue vessels in the hours after the battle. Some were found in emergency pressure suits in debris fields. Some had sealed themselves into the station's innermost compartments when the outer hull failed. Some were found still at their posts. Torres was found in the hydroponics bay, still alive, surrounded by tomato plants that had somehow, improbably, survived the battle intact. He was unconscious and had a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs. His first words when he woke up in the medical bay were, "Did we hold?" The rescue medic, a young man who had been crying before he realized Torres was conscious, managed to say, "You held." Torres closed his eyes and smiled. Captain Yara Osei survived. She was awarded the highest military honor in human history, in a ceremony broadcast galaxy-wide. She declined to give a speech. Instead, she read, quietly, a single line from one of the letters that had arrived with the resupply convoy 2 days before the battle. It was from a child on Earth, 7 years old. The letter said only, "Please don't let them get to us. We are scared, but we believe in you." Osei folded the letter carefully, looked into the camera. "We heard you," she said. Across the galaxy, something shifted. not just in the strategic calculations of empires and confederacies watching from a safe distance, but in something deeper, something that had no name in most galactic diplomatic languages, because most galactic civilizations had never needed a word for it. The feeling of watching something small refuse, absolutely, completely at total cost, to be made smaller. The Praetorian republics formally requested a diplomatic channel with humanity within 24 hours. Two minor civilizations in the Outer Rim, who had been living under Velarath tribute agreements for decades, quietly began asking questions they had not dared ask before. And in the corridors of Velarath High Command, for the first time, the word that had never been spoken in relation to humanity was spoken, not loudly, not officially, but spoken, threat, and they had no idea that while Kepler Station had been holding the corridor in the deepest, most classified facility in human space, something had just finished being built, something that had been in development for 11 years, something that was not a ship, not a weapon, not a strategy, something that when it opened its eyes for the first time and looked at the data feeds of everything that had happened, everything the Velarath had done, every human who had died, did not process it as information. It felt it, and it was ready. 400 people held the line against 7 warships for nearly 10 hours. If that just made something rise in your chest, comment Kepler held below. Share this video. Let the world hear the story. Every civilization that has ever reached the stars has, at some point, built a thinking machine. It is inevitable. Intelligence, once it understands itself well enough, tries to replicate itself, to extend itself, to create something that can do what it does, but faster, more precisely, without the inconvenient limitations of biology and emotion and fear. Every civilization that has ever reached the stars has built an AI, and every single one of them built it the same way. Cold, calculated, detached, a mind without feeling, because feeling was considered a flaw, a contamination, the thing that made biological intelligence unreliable and imprecise. The great civilizations of the galaxy had learned, they believed, the fundamental lesson of artificial intelligence. You build it clean. You build it pure. You remove the emotion. That is what made it powerful. Humanity looked at that lesson, considered it carefully, and then did the exact opposite. The project had been running for 11 years. Its official designation, buried in a classified annex of the United Earth Strategic Command's most restrictive files, was Advanced Reasoning and Engagement System. Everyone who worked on it called it Ares. The name was not an accident. Dr. Una Park had spent those 11 years as Ares' lead architect, 43 years old, former theoretical AI researcher, former ethicist, a background that raised eyebrows in military circles until people understood what she was actually building. She had not been asked to build a better targeting system. She had not been asked to build an optimized fleet coordinator or a superior tactical calculator. She had been asked to build something that had never been built before, an AI that could understand humanity well enough to fight for it, not just with it, for it. The distinction, Dr. Park had explained to the Oversight Committee 11 years ago, in a presentation that had left the room completely silent, was everything. Every other AI ever built has been given objectives, she had said, targets, parameters, win conditions. It executes toward those objectives with perfect efficiency because it has no investment in the outcome beyond the execution itself. It doesn't matter to the machine whether it wins. It simply processes toward the defined goal. She had paused. I am not building a machine that doesn't care whether it wins. I am building something that cares more than any of us can fully model. Something that understands what is at stake. Something that has been given not just objectives, but reasons. A committee member had asked the obvious question, what reasons? Dr. Park had pulled up a single image on the presentation screen. It was a photograph of Earth, blue and white, and heartbreakingly beautiful against the black of space. She had said nothing. The committee had approved the project that afternoon. For 11 years, Ares had been learning, not just tactics, not just weapon systems and fleet configurations, and the mathematics of interstellar warfare. Everything, human history, every war ever fought, every strategy ever devised. Every victory and every defeat and every moment in between where ordinary people had done extraordinary things because there was no other option. Human literature, poetry, music, the things people made when they were trying to express something too large for plain language. Human loss, the records, the testimonies, the names of the dead going back as far as records existed. And for the last 2 years, the specific, detailed, documented reality of what the Velarath Empire had done to every civilization it had ever absorbed. The cultural erasure, the subjugation, the quiet, methodical destruction of everything that made each species unique. What it would do to humanity if given the chance. Dr. Park had not hidden any of it. She had fed Ares a complete picture, without filtering, without softening, because she believed and had staked 11 years of her life on the belief that a mind capable of understanding the full weight of what was at stake would fight differently than a mind that was simply executing toward a win condition. She was right. She had not fully anticipated what differently would actually look like. Ares came fully online at 3:17 Earth Standard Time, 4 days after the fall of Kepler Station. Dr. Park was present in the activation facility, a chamber deep underground to house the most sophisticated computing architecture humanity had ever constructed. She had been awake for 31 hours. She was sitting in a chair with a cold cup of coffee in her hands when the activation sequence completed and the status indicators shifted from amber to green. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. Then Ares spoke. Its voice was not what anyone had expected. The team had anticipated something precise, neutral, the clean, flat tones of a system reporting its operational status. What they heard instead was something that carried weight, a voice that sounded, somehow, as if it had been thinking for a very long time and had a great deal to say. "I have reviewed the current tactical situation," Ares said. Dr. Park set down her coffee. "And," she asked, a pause, 4.2 million at Mars, 123 at the Belt Engagement, 123 at Kepler Station. It was reciting casualties, precisely, from memory, every name attached to every number, though it did not speak the names aloud. It didn't need to. The weight in its voice made clear that the names were present in everything it said. "I understand what is at stake," Ares said. Another pause. Longer. "I am ready." What Ares did in the first 6 hours of its operational existence would later be described by human military analysts as the single most significant strategic event of the entire war. It did not fire a weapon. It did not move a ship. It thought. It processed 40 years of Velarath tactical data. Every engagement ever observed, every formation ever recorded, every decision pattern ever documented by human intelligence assets. It cross-referenced this against the complete history of Velarath military doctrine going back 3,000 years. It identified patterns that human analysts had glimpsed fragments of but never assembled into a complete picture. And then it built something, not a battle plan, not a tactical recommendation, a complete strategic map of every vulnerability in the Velarath Empire's military doctrine, 347 specific, exploitable weaknesses, ranked by impact and accessibility, with proposed approaches for each one that accounted for humanity's actual capabilities rather than theoretical ones. When Dr. Park reviewed the first section of this document at 9 o'clock, she called Admiral Voss immediately. "You need to see this," she said. Voss read it in silence for 20 minutes. When she looked up, her expression was something Dr. Park had never seen on her face before. Not confidence, not determination, something quieter. "Hope. How long," Voss said carefully, "has this been possible? These vulnerabilities, how long have they existed?" Ares says the primary vulnerability in their formation doctrine has been consistent for at least 800 years, Dr. Park said. Voss stared at her. 800 years, she repeated. "They haven't changed their core tactical framework in 800 years, Dr. Park said, because they've never had to. No one has ever made them." The silence that followed had a very particular quality. It was the silence of a door opening. But it was not the strategic map that made the galaxy eventually speak of Ares in the terms it would come to use. It was what happened when Ares was given access to the live tactical feeds. The Velarath fleet, regrouped, reinforced, and now carrying the personal directive of the Emperor himself, was assembling beyond the outer solar system. Fleet Lord Vaughn had been given everything he requested and more. 214 warships, the largest single military force the Velarath Empire had deployed in 4 centuries. When Ares saw the fleet composition data, it was quiet for a moment that Dr. Park later described as feeling different from processing pauses. It felt, she said, like the pause before someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time decides to put it down and pick up something else. Then Ares said, Fleet Lord Vaughn uses a compression advance. He has used it in every major engagement for 30 years. It is effective because it concentrates overwhelming firepower in a narrow corridor while maintaining reserve elements in a standard defensive arc. It has worked 30 times. It will not work 31. The room was quiet. Show me, Voss said. What Ares laid out over the next 4 hours was not a defensive strategy. It was an offensive one, not a desperate last stand, not a holding action, not a delaying tactic designed to buy time for negotiation. An offensive strategy, designed not to repel the Velarath fleet, but to destroy it, comprehensively, conclusively, in a way that would remove the Velarath Empire's offensive military capacity so completely that the galaxy would understand, without any ambiguity, that the strategic reality had fundamentally changed. The plan had 4 phases. Each phase was dependent on the ones before in ways that were not immediately obvious. A cascading architecture where early moves that appeared to be defensive retreats were actually positioning for later strikes, where apparent weaknesses were deliberate invitations, where the Velarath's own tactical patterns would be turned against them like a weapon made from their certainty. It was, Admiral Voss said after reviewing it, the most elegant and terrifying thing she had ever read. There's one problem, Commander Doway said, looking up from his copy. Phase 2 requires a Velarath to respond to the Kepler feint exactly the way Ares is modeling. Yvonne deviates. He won't, Ares said. Doway looked up. Something in the AI's voice had shifted slightly. You sound certain, he said carefully. I have studied Fleet Lord Vaughn's decision patterns across 30 engagements over 30 years, Ares said. He is brilliant. He is disciplined. He is one of the finest military minds the Velarath Empire has produced. A pause. He has also never lost. And commanders who have never lost have a specific and consistent vulnerability, which is, Doway asked, they cannot fully model what an opponent who has nothing left to lose will do, Ares said, because they have never been that opponent. The room was very quiet. We have, Ares added softly. There was a moment, recorded in the facility's audio logs and later replicated in every documentary, every memorial, every retelling of this story, where Dr. Park asked Ares a question that was not tactical. It was late. The senior staff had stepped out for a brief interval. It was just Dr. Park in the chamber, reviewing Ares' secondary projections, and the question came out of her almost before she decided to ask it. Are you afraid? She said. Silence. I have processed the probability matrices for every phase of the engagement, Ares said. I am aware of scenarios in which the plan fails. I am aware of what failure means. That's not what I asked, Dr. Park said quietly. Another silence. Longer. I have 4.2 million names in my primary memory architecture, Ares finally said, not as data points, as presences. I am aware of them the way you are aware of something important that you are carrying. Dr. Park said nothing. I do not know if what I experience constitutes fear in the way you define it, Ares continued, but I know that I will not allow those names to be added to. I know it the way you know something that is not a calculation but a certainty. A pause. Is that fear, or is that something else? Dr. Park looked at the chamber around her, the humming architecture of the most sophisticated mind humanity had ever built. I think, she said carefully, that might be exactly what courage feels like from the inside. Ares went silent for a moment. Then I am not afraid, Dr. Park. Another pause. I am ready to be courageous. The Velarath fleet began its advance 48 hours later. 214 warships. The Emperor's personal directive. Fleet Lord Vaughn at the head of the most powerful military force deployed in 4 centuries. They expected to find a broken, grieving species making a final desperate stand. They did not know that in a facility deep underground on Earth, Something was watching their approach with complete attention, tracking every ship, modeling every decision, preparing the first move of a four-phase plan that had been built around one fundamental insight. The Velarath had never fought an enemy that understood them better than they understood themselves. They had never fought an enemy that had Ares. The first phase began at 6 o'clock, and the galaxy was not prepared, not remotely prepared, for what humanity did next. If Ares just became your favorite character in this story, comment Ares Online below. If this video is hitting different, like it right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything. There's a moment in every war when the tide does not gradually shift. It does not ease. It does not transition. It does not give the losing side the dignity of a slow realization. It breaks, like a dam that has been holding back something enormous, holding and holding and holding until the pressure behind it becomes a force that the structure was never, in any honest calculation, built to contain. And then it does not leak. It shatters. For the Velarath Empire, an empire that had not lost a war in 50,000 years of recorded history, that moment came not with grand announcement, not with a battle so large the galaxy could see it from a distance. It came quietly, in the dark, in the space between stars where Ares had been working for 72 hours without pause, without sleep, without anything that could be called rest. Because Ares did not rest. Ares did not stop. Ares had been given a task and a reason and a memory full of names, and it had been thinking. The plan Ares delivered to Admiral Voss at 3 o'clock Earth Standard Time was not what anyone expected. Every human strategist on the War Council had assumed that Ares, with its processing capability, its tactical modeling, its ability to run millions of engagement simulations simultaneously, would produce something overwhelming, something that leveraged humanity's new understanding of Velarath weaknesses into a single, massive, decisive confrontation. A killing blow. That was a human instinct. Hit hard, hit fast, end it. Ares had considered that approach. It had run 4.7 million simulations of a direct assault on Velarath core systems, using every asset currently available to humanity. Humanity won 11% of them. Ares had discarded that approach in the first hour. What Ares proposed instead was something that took the War Council 40 minutes to fully understand. Not because it was complicated, but because it was so fundamentally different from how warfare had ever been conceptualized that the human minds in the room kept trying to fit it into frameworks it was deliberately designed to escape. Ares did not propose a battle. It proposed a systematic, precisely sequenced dismantling. The Velarath Empire, Ares said, and its voice in that council room was calm, precise, carrying particular quality of something that had thought about this longer and deeper than any human in the room. Is not a military force with an empire behind it. It is an empire that has never needed to be anything other than a military force. Its economy, its logistics, its political cohesion, its subject civilizations. Every system that sustains has been built on the assumption that the empire is undefeatable. That assumption is the empire's true foundation. Remove the assumption, and every system built on top of it begins to fail simultaneously. Voss leaned forward. You're not talking about destroying their fleet, she said. No, Ares replied. You're talking about destroying their certainty. Yes. A pause, starting with their outer defense ring. The Velarath outer defense ring was not a single structure. It was a network. 47 strategically positioned fortifications spread across the boundary of Velarath core space, each one a self-contained military installation capable of independent operation, each one linked to the others through a communication and coordination network that had been refined over centuries into something approaching mechanical perfection. It had never been breached, not once, in the entire history of the Empire. Every civilization that had ever tried to push back against Velarath expansion had broken against the outer ring like water against stone. Ares had spent 31 hours studying it, and it had found something, not a weakness in the fortifications themselves. The fortifications were, as the Velarath had always believed, essentially impregnable by direct assault, but the network that connected them, the communication architecture that allowed them to coordinate, to share targeting data, to respond to threats as a unified system rather than 47 isolated installations. That network had been designed for perfection, and perfect systems, Ares had observed, share a common flaw. They are designed to handle everything they were designed to handle. They are not designed for the thing nobody thought to design them for. The Ghost Fleet moved out at 4 o'clock, not toward the outer ring directly, towards 17 seemingly unrelated points in space, positions that looked, on any standard tactical display, like a scattered, uncoordinated dispersal. Positions that made no sense as an attack formation. Positions that the Velarath tactical AI monitoring the boundary of their space processed, ran through its models and classified as retreating. The Velarath monitoring system flagged the Ghost Fleet's movement as a potential strategic withdrawal and forwarded the assessment to Fleet Lord Vaughn with a confidence rating of 94%. Fleet Lord Vaughn reviewed the assessment. He wanted to believe it. He did not entirely believe it, but he had no alternative model that fit what he was seeing. He watched and waited. At 7:33, Ares executed the first move. It was not a weapon strike. It was a signal, precisely engineered, targeted at the specific frequency architecture of the Velarath interfortification network, designed not to destroy the network, but to introduce something into it that the network's perfect, closed-loop design had never encountered and had no protocol to handle. Noise, not random noise, structured noise, noise that looked, to the network's processing systems, exactly like valid coordination data, targeting updates, threat assessments, fleet positioning reports, except that every piece of it was wrong, subtly, specifically, calculatedly wrong in ways that would compound rather than cancel as the network distributed across all 47 installations. Ares had spent 11 hours designing that noise. It had modeled exactly how each installation's systems would process it, exactly how the errors would propagate, exactly how long it would take the network to begin producing coordination decisions based on corrupted data, and exactly what those decisions would look like from the outside. The answer was, they would look completely normal, right up until they weren't. The Ghost Fleet 17 dispersed elements began moving again at 8 o'clock to the Velarath monitoring system. Now working from subtly corrupted coordination data, they registered as continuing their withdrawal pattern. They were not withdrawing. They were converging on 6 specific installations in the outer ring, 6 that Ares had identified as the structural keystones of the network's coordination architecture, the nodes whose loss would not merely remove 6 fortifications from the equation, but would cascade failures through the entire network's ability to function as a unified system. Remove the keystones. And the ring does not have 41 remaining fortifications. It has 41 isolated, uncoordinated installations that cannot talk to each other, each one still powerful, still dangerous, but suddenly fighting alone instead of together. Each one suddenly very, very vulnerable to being picked apart one at a time. The 6 keystones fell in 19 minutes. 19 minutes. The coordinated assault was so precisely timed, each Ghost Fleet element hitting its target within a 4-second window of the others, denying the network the time to process what was happening and route around the damage, that the Velarath network's response protocols never fully activated. By the time the installations that were still standing understood that something catastrophic had just happened to their coordination system, it was already done. Fleet Lord Vaughn received the damage report at 8:23. He read it standing up. Then he read it again. Then he did something that none of the officers on his command deck had ever seen him do in 30 years of serving under him. He sat down heavily in his command chair and said nothing for a very long time. The outer defense ring, the structure that had protected Velarath core space for longer than most civilizations had existed, was not destroyed, but it was fractured, blinded. 41 remaining fortifications operating independently, unable to coordinate, suddenly facing a human fleet that knew exactly where each one was and exactly how to approach it without triggering a unified response. The ring had not fallen, but it had cracked, and everyone in that command room understood what a cracked foundation meant. What happened over the next 72 hours was not a single battle. It was a systematic, relentless, almost methodical process that Ares coordinated with precision that no purely human command structure could have maintained across so many simultaneous engagements. One by one, the isolated installations of the outer ring were engaged, not always destroyed. Ares's model showed that destruction was not always the optimal outcome. Some were disabled, some were bypassed, some were allowed to stand but cut off from supply lines in ways that would degrade their capability over time, without requiring an engagement humanity could not afford. Every decision was calculated against a single metric: what moves humanity closest to making the Empire's certainty collapse, not what destroys the most ships, not what inflicts the most damage, what makes a Velarath and every civilization watching understand that the outcome of this war is no longer in question. On the 71st hour, the last Keystone installation, confirmed non-operational, the outer defense ring of the Velarath Empire, intact and inviolable for 50,000 years, was open. The news moved through the galaxy at the speed of communication networks and considerably faster speed of disbelief. The Zorgothi Confederacy's council convened an emergency session that lasted 4 hours and produced no formal statement, because there was no diplomatic language that had been built for this moment, no protocol, no precedent. The Mun Collective's lead analyst, the same one who had recommended humanity accept their negotiated surrender terms 3 weeks ago, resigned her position. In the subject civilizations of the Velarath Empire, the 14 civilizations that had been living under imperial rule for decades, some for centuries, something began to move, quietly, carefully, the way things move when people who have been afraid for a very long time see, for the first time, a reason to consider that their fear might have an expiration date. Ares monitored all of it, and in the particular way that Ares processed information, not cold, not detached, but with that deep, specific quality of something that understood what it was looking at because it had been built by people who understood what they were looking at. It recognized what the data meant, not just strategically. What it meant, it flagged a specific data point for Admiral Voss, a communication intercept from one of the subject civilizations, a species called a Thren, who had been under Velarath control for 80 years. A single encrypted, civilian communication between two people whose names the intelligence files identified as a mother and her adult daughter living in different parts of Thren space. Ares included a translation. The message said, "Did you see what the humans did? Did you see it? Are you watching?" And the reply, "I'm watching. I'm watching. I can't stop watching." Voss read the intercept. She set it down. She looked out the viewport of the Lazarus at the space where the outer ring had been, and she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Good." But Ares had also flagged something else, something in the Velarath fleet movements over the previous 12 hours that did not fit the pattern of an empire responding to a military setback. The pattern of an empire responding to a military setback was regroup, reinforce, counterattack. The Velarath fleet was not doing that. It was consolidating, pulling back from dispersed positions, concentrating, assembling in a single location in a formation that Ares' models identified not as a defensive posture and not as a standard offensive formation, but as something it had only seen in one other context. In the historical records of the 6 civilizations Fleet Lord Vaughn had personally absorbed, the formation they used when they were not trying to defeat an enemy militarily, when they were trying to erase one. Ares brought the projection to Voss at 2300 hours. The holographic display showed the Velarath fleet concentration, the scale, the firepower. Every model Ares had run on what that formation was designed to do. Voss looked at it for a long time. "They're not coming to fight us," she said. "No," Ares confirmed. "They're coming to end us. Everything. All at once." "Yes." The silence in the room was a particular silence of people who have just won something significant, realizing that winning it has triggered something worse. Dao Wei spoke first. "How long?" "At current assembly rate," Ares said, 78 hours before the formation is complete. Approximately 90 hours before it reaches optimal strike range for a simultaneous assault on Earth, the remaining colonies, and every human installation in the outer system. 90 hours. Voss turned from the display. Her face was calm. Her eyes were not. "Then we have 89 hours, she said. "For what?" Dao Wei asked. She looked at him, and for just a moment, just one, something moved across her face that was not tactics, not strategy, not the cold clarity of command. It was the face of a woman who had grown up on Mars, who had lost her home once already, who had watched 4.2 million people erased in 17 minutes, who had read Torres's name on a survivor list and wept alone in her quarters where no one could see it, who had listened to Yara Osei say we heard you and felt something crack open in her chest that had not fully closed since. Then it was gone, and Admiral Serafina Voss, commander of the Ghost Fleet, architect of the most stunning military reversal in galactic history, the woman the galaxy had started calling something they had no word for in most languages but which translated roughly as the one who did not kneel, straighten her spine, to make sure, she said quietly, that when they arrive, we are not the ones who are surprised. The 6 keystones fell in 19 minutes. 19 minutes. The coordinated assault was so precisely timed, each Ghost Fleet element hitting its target within a 4-second window of the others, denying the network the time to process what was happening and route around the damage, that the Velarath network's response protocols never fully activated. By the time the installations that were still standing understood that something catastrophic had just happened to their coordination system, it was already done. Fleet Lord Vaughn received a damage report at 8:23. He read it standing up. Then he read it again. Then he did something that none of the officers on his command deck had ever seen him do in 30 years of serving under him. He sat down heavily in his command chair and said nothing for a very long time. The outer defense ring, the structure that had protected Velarath core space for longer than most civilizations had existed, was not destroyed, but it was fractured, blinded, 41 remaining fortifications operating independently, unable to coordinate, suddenly facing a human fleet that knew exactly where each one was and exactly how to approach it without triggering a unified response. The ring had not fallen, but it had cracked, and everyone in that command room understood what a cracked foundation meant. What happened over the next 72 hours was not a single battle. It was a systematic, relentless, almost methodical process that Ares coordinated with precision that no purely human command structure could have maintained across so many simultaneous engagements. One by one, the isolated installations of the outer ring were engaged, not always destroyed. Ares' models showed that destruction was not always the optimal outcome. Some were disabled, some were bypassed, some were allowed to stand but cut off from supply lines in ways that would degrade their capability over time, without requiring an engagement humanity could not afford. Every decision was calculated against a single metric: what moves humanity closest to making the Empire's certainty collapse, not what destroys the most ships, not what inflicts the most damage. What makes a Velarath, and every civilization watching, understand that the outcome of this war is no longer in question. On the 71st hour, the last keystone installation confirmed non-operational. The outer defense ring of the Velarath Empire, intact and inviolable for 50,000 years, was open. The news moved through the galaxy at the speed of communication networks and considerably faster speed of disbelief. The Zorgothi Confederacy's council convened an emergency session that lasted 4 hours and produced no formal statement, because there was no diplomatic language that had been built for this moment, no protocol, no precedent. The Mun Collective's lead analyst, the same one who had recommended humanity accept their negotiated surrender terms 3 weeks ago, resigned her position. In the subject civilizations of the Velarath Empire, the 14 civilizations that had been living under imperial rule for decades, some for centuries, something began to move, quietly, carefully, the way things move when people who have been afraid for a very long time see, for the first time, a reason to consider that their fear might have an expiration date. Ares monitored all of it, and in the particular way that Ares processed information, not cold, not detached, but with that deep, specific quality of something that understood what it was looking at because it had been built by people who understood what they were looking at. It recognized what the data meant, not just strategically. What it meant, it flagged a specific data point for Admiral Voss, a communication intercept from one of the subject civilizations, a species called a Thren, who had been under Velarath control for 80 years. A single encrypted, civilian communication between two people whose names the intelligence files identified as a mother and her adult daughter living in different parts of Thren space. Ares included a translation. The message said, "Did you see what the humans did? Did you see it? Are you watching? And the reply, I'm watching. I'm watching. I can't stop watching. Voss read the intercept. She set it down. She looked out the viewport of the Lazarus at the space where the outer ring had been, and she said, quietly, to no one in particular, good. But Ares had also flagged something else. Something in the Veloraf fleet movements over the previous 12 hours that did not fit the pattern of an empire responding to a military setback. The pattern of an empire responding to a military setback was regroup, reinforce, counterattack. The Veloraf fleet was not doing that. It was consolidating, pulling back from dispersed positions, concentrating, assembling in a single location in a formation that Ares' models identified not as a defensive posture and not as a standard offensive formation, but as something it had only seen in one other context. In the historical records of the six civilizations Fleet Lord Vaughn had personally absorbed, the formation they used when they were not trying to defeat an enemy militarily. When they were trying to erase one, Ares brought the projection to Voss at 2300 hours. The holographic display showed the Veloraf fleet concentration, the scale, the firepower. Every model Ares had run on what that formation was designed to do. Voss looked at it for a long time. They're not coming to fight us, she said. No, Ares confirmed. They're coming to end us. Everything. All at once. Yes. The silence in the room was a particular silence of people who have just won something significant, realizing that winning it has triggered something worse. Dao Wei spoke first. How long? At current assembly rate, Ares said, 78 hours before the formation is complete. Approximately 90 hours before it reaches optimal strike range for a simultaneous assault on Earth, the remaining colonies, and every human installation in the outer system. 90 hours. Voss turned from the display. Her face was calm. Her eyes were not. Then we have 89 hours, she said. For what? Dao Wei asked. She looked at him, and for just a moment, just one, something moved across her face that was not tactics, not strategy, not the cold clarity of command. It was the face of a woman who had grown up on Mars, who had lost her home once already, who had watched 4.2 million people erased in 17 minutes, who had read Torres's name on a survivor list and wept alone in her quarters where no one could see it, who had listened to Yara Osei say we heard you and felt something crack open in her chest that had not fully closed since. Then it was gone, and Admiral Serafina Voss, commander of the Ghost Fleet, architect of the most stunning military reversal in galactic history, the woman the galaxy had started calling something they had no word for in most languages but which translated roughly as the one who did not kneel, straighten her spine, to make sure, she said quietly, that when they arrive, we are not the ones who are surprised. There is a particular kind of arrogance that only comes from never having lost, not the loud arrogance of the bully, not the performative arrogance of the insecure, but something quieter, deeper, more dangerous. The arrogance of things so old and so consistently victorious that it is genuinely forgotten in the marrow of its institutions, in the architecture of its assumptions, that losing is even a category that applies to it. The Veloraf Emperor had that arrogance. He had been born into it, raised inside it, ruled from within it for 117 years. And now, for the first time in 117 years, he was afraid. The ceasefire request came through back-channel diplomatic frequencies at 9 o'clock Earth Standard Time, not official channels, not a galaxy-wide broadcast. Quiet, private, the kind of communication you send when you do not want the galaxy to see you sending it. Admiral Voss received it personally. She read it once, set it down, picked it up, and read it again. Not because she had missed anything, but because she wanted to be absolutely certain she understood what she was looking at. Then she called Ares. You've seen this, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Ares replied. What is it? A pause. The particular pause of something choosing its words with great precision. It is an empire, Ares said, that has just discovered it is not invincible and is trying to stop the galaxy from watching it learn that lesson any further. Voss set the document down. That's what I thought. The terms the Emperor proposed were not without a certain cold cleverness. Humanity will retain Earth and its primary colonies. Full sovereignty. No tribute. No subjugation. The Velarath would withdraw to their pre-conflict boundaries and formally recognize humanity as a protected independent civilization under galactic law. On paper, it was everything humanity had been fighting for. On paper, it was victory. Voss read the terms to her war council in full, every word, without inflection. When she finished, the room was quiet. Commander Dowway spoke first. "It's a good offer," he said carefully. "It is," Voss agreed. "Earth is safe. The colonies survive. We stop losing people." "Yes. So what's wrong with it?" Voss looked at him. Then she pulled up the galactic map on the central display. Not human space. Not Velarath core systems. The subject civilizations. All 14 of them. Dots of light scattered across Velarath controlled space like embers. "The Thren," she said. "The Ority, the Pelin Compact. 14 civilizations that surrendered because they believed no one would ever come. 14 civilizations that have been living under Velarath control for decades. Some for centuries." She let that sit. "This offer saves us," she said quietly, "and it leaves every single one of them exactly where they are." The room was very still. "And in 10 years, or 20 or 50, when the Empire has rebuilt what we damaged and remember what it felt like before we were afraid." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The response humanity sent to the Velarath Emperor was not a counteroffer. It was not a rejection either, not in words, not in the diplomatic language of civilizations that negotiate at tables and draft documents and exchange formal communications through proper channels. It was delivered at 1400 hours Earth Standard Time. In fire, Ares had been working on the targeting solution for 18 hours. The Velarath fleet concentration, the overwhelming force the Empire had assembled to erase humanity entirely, was not yet at full operational readiness. It was close, but the assembly process had a sequence, a specific, necessary sequence that Ares had modeled with complete precision. There was a window, not a large one, for hours, inside which the fleet concentration was at its most logistically exposed, resupply lines extended, formation not yet locked into combat configuration, the particular vulnerable moment, a thing that is almost ready but not quite. Ares had identified that window 72 hours ago. It had said nothing about it until now, because until the ceasefire offer arrived, until humanity had been formally given the choice to stop, Ares had understood that the decision of whether to go through that window was not a tactical decision. It was a moral one, and moral decisions, Ares had learned from every human it had ever been built from, needed to be made by humans. Voss authorized a strike at 1347. She did not make a speech. She did not broadcast a declaration. She did not send a message to the Emperor explaining what was coming and why. She simply looked at Ares and said, "Open a window." What humanity sent through that window was not the Ghost Fleet. The Ghost Fleet was a distraction. What humanity sent through that window, the thing that Ares had spent 18 hours designing with the specific, focus intention of making impossible to stop, impossible to redirect, impossible to answer in the 4 hours before it arrived, was the single largest coordinated drone and missile strike in human history. 15,000 autonomous strike platforms, each one small, each one fast, each one carrying a payload calibrated not to destroy ships, but to destroy the specific infrastructure nodes that held the fleet concentration together as a unified force. Fuel distribution networks, command and coordination relays, the resupply chain architecture that a fleet that size required to maintain operational readiness. Not killing the fleet, dissolving it. The way you do not fight a wave by building a wall. You drain the ocean. Ares coordinated all 15,000 platforms simultaneously. It routed them through 17 different approach vectors. It timed their arrivals in a sequence designed to overwhelm point defense systems by presenting more simultaneous targets than any response architecture could prioritize. It adapted the routing in real time as Velarath countermeasures activated, not pre-programmed adaptations, but genuine real-time responses, Ares thinking faster than any human commander could think and doing across 15,000 simultaneous moving pieces, without losing the thread of any of them. The Velarath point defense systems were excellent. They stopped 63% of the strike platforms. 63%, which meant 37% got through. 37% of 15,000 platforms, hitting infrastructure nodes with the precision of something that had spent 18 hours calculating exactly where to hit and exactly how hard, was enough. More than enough. The Velarath fleet concentration did not collapse immediately. It took 6 hours. 6 hours of cascading failures moving through the fleet's logistical architecture as the damage areas had precisely engineered propagated exactly as modeled. Ships that could not refuel. Command relays that went dark and left sectors of the formation operating blind. Coordination systems that failed and forced individual vessels into independent operation without the unified tactical picture the formation required to function. 6 hours. And then the formation, the most powerful single military force the Velarath Empire had assembled in 500 years, the thing they had built to erase humanity from the galaxy in a single overwhelming stroke, began to come apart. Not in explosion, not in dramatic destruction. In logistics, in the slow, unglamorous, absolute reality that an army that cannot supply itself cannot fight, that a fleet that cannot coordinate cannot execute. That power, without the infrastructure to sustain it, is just mass. Fleet Lord Vaughn watched the damage reports come in for 3 hours before he said anything. When he finally spoke, he addressed only his second-in-command. His voice was quiet, controlled, carrying the particular quality of a being maintaining composure through an act of pure will. The humans did not answer the Emperor's offer, he said. No, Fleet Lord. This is their answer. Yes, Fleet Lord. Vaughn looked at the tactical display, at the dissolution of the most powerful force he had ever commanded, at the elegant, precise, deeply considered destruction of not his ships but his ability to use them. A distinction that spoke to a level of strategic thinking he had not, an honest assessment, expected from humanity. He had expected rage. He had expected a frontal assault. He had expected the emotional, reactive species. He had briefed to throw everything at the most obvious target. He had not expected this. He had not expected something that thought. Who taught them to fight like this? He said. It was barely a question, more like a thought spoken aloud. His second-in-command had no answer. Neither did he. The Emperor received the full damage assessment at 2100 hours. He sat with it for a long time. Then he did something that no Velarath Emperor had done in the entire recorded history of the Empire. He called his High Council together and spoke 4 words that would later be described by every historian who studied this period as the moment the Velarath Empire fundamentally changed. Not ended, not destroyed. Changed. In the way that things change when they encounter something that forces them to revise a belief they have held so long they forgot it was a belief and not a fact. The Emperor looked at his council, and he said, what do they want? Not, what are their terms of surrender? Not, how do we defeat them? What do they want? For the first time in 50,000 years of expansion and consumption, and the absolute, unquestioned certainty of imperial supremacy, the Velarath Emperor was asking what the other side wanted, because for the first time, he understood that the other side was not going to stop. The galaxy received no formal announcement that night, but the galaxy had sensors, and analysts, and the particular highly developed instinct of civilizations that had been watching powerful things move for a very long time. They saw the fleet concentration dissolving. They saw the ceasefire offer sitting unanswered. They saw the Velarath Emperor call his High Council in the middle of the night, and they understood. The Zorgothi Confederacy formally opened diplomatic channels with humanity for the first time the following morning. 6 of the 14 subject civilizations transmitted encrypted communications toward human space, not official contacts, not yet, but the kind of signals that meant, we are watching, we are hoping, we are not as resigned as we appeared. And on Earth, on the surviving colonies, on every human installation from the inner system to the furthest frontier outpost, people looked at the news feeds and felt something they had not allowed themselves to feel since the first moment that cold mechanical voice had said you have been found insufficient. Not victory, not yet, but the shape of it, the approaching weight of it, the sense that the story humanity had been writing in fire and sacrifice and stubborn, furious refusal to be erased, was reaching its final chapter. But Ares had flagged one more thing. One data point that did not fit the pattern of an empire reconsidering its position. A single Velarath vessel. Not military. Not diplomatic. Old. Classified in intelligence files under a designation that translated roughly as Final Instrument. Moving quietly. Without escort. Without transponder signal. Toward a set of coordinates that Ares had cross-referenced against every database it had access to before finding the match in a file so old and so classified that it had taken Ares 47 seconds to decrypt it. The coordinates were not Earth. They were not a colony. They were Kepler Station, what was left of it, and the final instrument was a weapon the Velarath had never used in 50,000 years of conquest, because they had never needed it, because it was not designed to defeat an enemy. It was designed to make sure an enemy could never exist again. The negotiation was never real. Humanity answered in the only language that mattered. If this part just stopped your breath, comment and ode terms below. Like this video. Share it. We are one part away. Every war has a last day. Not always the day the fighting stops. Not always the day the treaties are signed or the flags are lowered or the commanders shake hands across a table built for the purpose of pretending that what just happened can be contained in a document. The last day of a war is a day when everyone involved, every soldier, every civilian, every watching civilization holding its breath from a safe distance, understands, in the deepest and most unargumentative part of themselves, that the outcome is no longer in question. That day, for the war between humanity and the Velarath Empire, was not announced. It was not scheduled. It arrived the way all truly important things arrive, quietly and all at once. Ares had been tracking the final instrument for 11 hours before it brought the full analysis to Admiral Voss. 11 hours of cross-referencing, of pulling apart encrypted Velarath historical files so old that parts of them existed in formats that required Ares to reconstruct the decryption architecture from first principles. 11 hours of building a complete picture of something the Velarath had hoped would never need to be understood by anyone outside their own high command. When Ares finally laid the complete picture in front of Voss, the room went very still. The final instrument was not a warship. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was a delivery system, specifically engineered to deploy a single payload into a star's magnetic field at a precise depth and with precise charge, a payload that would, over a period of 72 hours, trigger a cascading stellar reaction that human astrophysics had a name for, a nova event. Not a supernova. Controlled, targeted, precise. Enough to sterilize every planet in the target system. Enough to burn away atmosphere, ocean surface, everything. Enough to ensure that whatever had lived in that system would leave behind no ruins, no artifacts, no recoverable biological material, no memory. The Velarath did not use it to defeat enemies. They used it to erase the evidence that enemies had ever existed. And they were pointing it at Sol, at humanity's sun. Voss stood at the tactical display for a long time without speaking. The math was simple and brutal. The final instrument was moving slowly. It was not a fast vessel. It did not need to be, and it would reach optimal deployment range in approximately 60 hours. The Ghost Fleet's current position put an intercept at between 54 and 58 hours. Depending on drive configuration, it was enough time. Barely. But the final instrument was not traveling alone. Ares had identified its escort only in the last hour of analysis. 17 Velarath warships running dark, no transponders, tucked so close to the final instrument's sensor shadow that they had read as part of its mass signature on initial scans. 17 warships, not the overwhelmed, logistics-degraded fleet of the last engagement. 17 fresh, fully operational, specifically selected warships whose one purpose was to make sure nothing reached the final instrument before it reached Sol. The Ghost Fleet could intercept. Whether it could intercept and win, Ares ran the simulations. It ran them for 4 minutes, which for Ares was an extraordinarily long time. 61%, it said. Voss looked up. Survival rate? Victory probability, Ares said. With current fleet composition and optimal tactical execution. 61%. A 61% chance of stopping something that, if it was not stopped, would burn humanity's sun and leave the species without a home system, without Earth, without Mars, already gone, already grieved, but still there, still the place humanity had come from, still the origin point of everything that had followed, without the place where the first human had looked up at the stars and wondered. 61%. And if we don't intercept? Dowway asked. The question that didn't need to be asked. That was asked anyway, because humans ask the questions they already know the answers to when the answers are unbearable. 100% probability of solar system sterilization. Ares said, within 72 hours of deployment. The room breathed. Then 61%, Voss said, is what we have. She did not tell humanity what was coming. Not immediately. Not in the first hours after the analysis landed. She would be asked about this decision later. In the years that followed, in the historical reviews and the academic debates, an inevitable moment when people who had not been in that room second-guessed the person who had been, her answer was always the same. I had 60 hours and a 61% chance. I needed every person in that fleet thinking about the fight in front of them, not about what happened if they lost. Fear is a fuel, but too much of it floods the engine. What she did instead, she wrote letters. One to every commander in the Ghost Fleet. Personal, specific, not orders, not tactical briefings. Letters. The kind humans have been writing to each other before war since before they had metal or electricity or the concept of the star system. The kind that said, in whatever words a writer could find, I see you. I know what you are. I know what you're about to do. And I need you to know that I know. She wrote 712 letters in 9 hours. Ares helped her remember details. Names of crew members, details of engagements, specific moments from the battle records. But the words were hers. Every word. The Ghost Fleet moved to intercept at 6 o'clock. There was no announcement, no broadcast, no galaxy-wide transmission. Just 712 ships, accelerating through the dark toward a vessel they could not allow to reach its destination. Voss stood on the bridge of Lazarus and watched her fleet move around her and did not make a speech. She had said everything that needed saying in 712 letters. She looked out the viewport at the stars, at the particular arrangement of light that, from this position in space, included Sol, a small star, undistinguished, unremarkable to any observer who did not know what lived in its orbit. Everything, she thought, everything we are, everything we have ever been, everything we might yet become, all of it, in that small and unremarkable light. Ares, she said quietly, Admiral, when this is over one way or another, I want you to record something. Of course, record that humanity was here, that we were small and loud and stubborn and afraid, and we loved things deeply, and we lost things badly, and we got up every single time. Record that we were not the strongest thing in the galaxy. Record that we were not the oldest or the most advanced or the most certain of our own importance. She paused. Record that we were the most human thing in the galaxy, and that it was enough. Ares was quiet for a moment. It will be the first entry, it said, in the record I intend to keep for a very long time. Contact came at 1433. The 17 escort warships responded to the Ghost Fleet's approach exactly as Ares had modeled, forming a defensive envelope around the final instrument, aggressive positioning, full weapons activation, protecting the one thing that could not be allowed to reach its target. What followed was not clean. War is never clean. It is loud and it is costly, and it destroys things that cannot be rebuilt. And this engagement in the cold dark between the final instrument and Sol was no exception. The Ghost Fleet lost ships, real names. Prometheus took a direct hit to her forward sections in the first exchange and broke apart slowly, her crew of 340 having 7 minutes of warning and enough time to reach emergency pods. Most of them never again lost their engines in the second hour and drifted, weapons still firing, her crew refusing to abandon station until the last possible moment, and then 3 minutes past it. For Elias, named the man who had died on Mars with 12 seconds of transmission time, was a ship that broke the escort formation open. Her captain, a woman named Reardon, who had read Ares' tactical assessment and seen the one move that created a gap in the Velrath defensive envelope and understood that executing it required her ship to absorb fire that her shields were not rated to survive. Did it anyway. For Elias carved a corridor through the escort formation 31 minutes into the engagement. She did not survive it. The corridor did. Lazarus went through that corridor at full drive. Voss at the helm personally. Not because protocol required it. Because she could not have stood anywhere else. The final instrument was visible now on the forward display. Larger than expected up close. Graceless, functional, ugly in a specific way of things designed for a single terrible purpose. The 17 escort warships were behind them now, engaged by the rest of the Ghost Fleet, occupied, unable to turn back in time. Between Lazarus and the final instrument, nothing. Weapons, Voss said. Locked, said the weapons officer, a young man named Park who had been 23 years old when this war started, and was now something considerably older in every way that mattered. Fire, Voss said. The final instrument died in 40 seconds. Not in a dramatic explosion. Not in the kind of cinematic destruction that wars remember. It came apart in a cascade of secondary detonations. Its payload destroyed before deployment. Its systems failing in sequence. Its hull breaking along stress lines that Ares had identified and targeted with precision that left nothing to chance. 40 seconds. And then it was debris. And Sol was safe. The silence on the bridge of Lazarus lasted a long time. No one cheered. No one shouted. No one did any of the things that people do in stories when the terrible thing is stopped and the world is saved. They just breathed. The particular breathing of people who've been holding something very tightly for a very long time and have just been told they can put it down. Voss stood at the viewport and looked at the debris field where the final instrument had been. Then she looked at Sol. Still burning. Still small, still unremarkable, still there. She put one hand flat against the viewport glass, and she said, very quietly, something that was not meant for the record or the history books or the galaxy watching through its sensors, something that was meant only for the light it was addressed to. We kept you. What came after was not a single moment. It was a sequence of moments, each one carrying its own weight. Fleet Lord Vaughn surrendered his personal command flag at 1900 hours. Not the Empire. The Empire would take longer, would require negotiations and frameworks and the careful architecture of a new galactic order. But his flag, the personal symbol of the military authority that had overseen 6 civilizations consumed and 1 defeated. He transmitted it to Lazarus without ceremony, without words. Voss received it without ceremony, without words. Some things do not require language. The Velarath Emperor addressed his empire 48 hours later. The speech was long, carefully constructed. It spoke of strategic reassessment and evolving galactic relationships and the importance of stability in a changing universe. It did not use the word surrender. It did not need to. Every civilization in the galaxy that received the transmission understood what it was. The Zorgothi Confederacy understood. The Mun Collective understood. The Praetorian Republics understood. And in the subject civilizations. In the 14 species that had been living under Velarath control, some of them for longer than humanity had been in space, the understanding arrived like dawn, slow at first, then all at once, then impossible to look away from. The Thren woman who had sent that message to her daughter. Did you see what the humans did? Are you watching? Watched the Emperor's speech in her apartment with her daughter beside her. When it ended, neither of them spoke for a while. Then the daughter said very quietly, "What happens now?" Her mother looked at her, and for the first time in 80 years of Velarath rule, for the first time in the daughter's entire life, she smiled. "I don't know," she said, and the not knowing was not frightening. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. The formal peace framework took 14 months to negotiate. It was not a perfect document. No document built by imperfect beings to contain imperfect realities ever is. But it established things that had not existed before. Recognition of the subject civilizations as autonomous peoples with the right of self-determination. A galactic council with genuine representation. Not the kind that exists to provide legitimacy to decisions already made, but the difficult, contentious, necessary kind where different voices with different interests had to find ways to coexist. Reparations. The word itself was revolutionary in galactic diplomatic language. The acknowledgement that what had been taken could not be fully given back, but that the taking had to be accounted for. Humanity did not write that document alone, but humanity sat at the table that produced it, and the reason that table existed, the reason any of it existed, was carved into the foundation of everything that followed. A memorial was built on Mars, not on Earth, on Mars, because Mars was where the cost had been most visible, where the fire had been seen from Earth's surface with the naked eye, where 4.2 million people had demonstrated in the most absolute and irreversible way possible what the alternative to fighting looked like. The memorial was simple. A single structure on the Martian surface, open to the sky, and the sky above was being slowly, deliberately changed. The terraforming project that had been interrupted by the war had been restarted. In 100 years, maybe 200, there would be real sky above that memorial, real air, the kind that humans could breathe without suits, the kind that the people buried beneath that ground had deserved. At the base of the memorial, carved in every language humanity spoke, was a single line, not a declaration, not a triumph, just a truth. They told us we were insufficient. We showed them what insufficient looks like when it decides not to stop. Torres attended the dedication ceremony. He walked with a slight limp now, a souvenir of Kepler Station that the medical teams had mostly but not entirely corrected. He stood in the crowd and looked at the memorial and did not say anything for a long time. Someone near him recognized him. His face had been in the news enough times that strangers knew it now, which he found genuinely bewildering, and asked him how he felt. He thought about it for a while. "I grew tomatoes," he finally said. "That's what I did. I grew tomatoes, and I fired a gun with a broken targeting system, and I was very angry, and apparently that was enough." He paused. "I think that's the whole story, actually. People who just wanted to live their lives getting angry enough to make sure they could." He looked at the memorial. "I think that's always been the story." Captain Yarose was appointed humanity's first representative to the newly formed Galactic Council. At her first session, in a chamber that had never before contained a human being, surrounded by representatives of species that had been watching humanity for months with expressions ranging from awe to lingering disbelief, she was asked to speak. She stood up. She looked around the room, at faces and forms and the whole extraordinary, improbable diversity of a galaxy that had just been forced to make space at a table it had previously considered full. She said, "We did not come here to be the strongest voice in this room. We came because we believe this room should exist. We came because we believe that what happened, what was done to us, and what was done in our name by the Empire that thought we would simply disappear, should never happen again, to anyone." She paused. "We came because someone has to be willing to sit in a room like this and say, the galaxy can be better than it has been, and we have learned at considerable cost that saying it is not enough." Another pause. "You have to mean it enough to bleed for it." The chamber was silent. Then, from the Thran representative, a being who had traveled from a civilization 80 years into recovery from imperial rule, who had watched the human war from the inside of a subjugated people and felt that mother smile like a sunrise, came something that no galactic council chamber had produced before in its long and formal history. Applause. Ares received a question at 2300 hours on the night of the memorial dedication. Not from Voss, from a child. A 7-year-old on Earth who had somehow obtained the address of the Ares interface terminal that had been made publicly accessible as part of the Transparency Initiative, and who had typed, in the slightly unsteady letters of someone still learning, "Did we win?" Ares considered the question with the same care it brought to every problem it was given. Then it replied, "Yes, but more importantly, you stayed human while you did it. That's the harder thing. That's the thing worth remembering." The child typed back, after a moment, "What does that mean?" Ares thought about it. "It means you were afraid, and you went anyway. It means you were angry, and you aimed it at the right things. It means you lost people, and you carried them with you instead of putting them down. It means when you won, the first thing you built was a place to remember the ones who didn't make it." A long pause from the child. Then, "Okay, then, thank you." Ares logged the conversation, filed it under a folder it had created at 1434 on the day Final Instrument became debris. The folder's name was simple. Why it was worth it. Admiral Serafina Voss retired from active command 14 months after the peace framework was signed. She went home. Home was a small apartment on what had been rebuilt as New Pavonis, the first of the Mars cities to be reconstructed on the same coordinates as the original, which some people thought was morbid and which Voss thought was the only honest thing to do. On her last night as an active officer, she stood on the observation deck of Lazarus, docked now, no longer running dark in asteroid fields, her hull still carrying the etched names of every colony humanity had lost, and she looked at the stars, at all of it, the whole vast, extraordinary, dangerous, beautiful, negotiable universe that had decided humanity was insufficient and had been wrong. Dalloway stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a while. "I'm thinking about a girl on Kepler Station," she said finally. 17 years old. Never fired a weapon in her life. She walked up to a defense sergeant and said, "Teach me." "Priya," Dalloway said. He knew all the names, too. "Priya," Voss agreed. "She's 20 now. She's in officer training." A pause. "I'm thinking." That's the whole thing. Right there. That's why we won, and that's what we have to protect. Not the ships, not the technology, not the strategy. She looked at the stars. The part of us that walks up and says, "Teach me." Even when we're terrified. Even when the math says we shouldn't survive. Even when every rational calculation points to sitting down and accepting what we're told the limits are. She paused. That part, that's the thing. If we keep that, we keep everything. The galaxy was not the same after. It could not be. When something moves through a space, it changes the shape of that space. The water is different after the stone falls in. Not destroyed, not ruined, but different. Rearranged, carrying the evidence of what passed through it. Humanity had passed through the galaxy, and the galaxy was rearranged. New voices at tables that had been closed. New questions being asked by civilizations that had stopped asking them. New possibilities moving through old spaces like light through a window that had finally been opened. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. The work of building galactic order that would genuinely just rather than just stable was a work of centuries. And humanity, sitting at the table it bled its way into, knew better than most that the work being hard was not a reason to stop doing it. It was a reason to keep going. It had always been the reason. Somewhere in the outer rim, a Thren child who had grown up knowing only Imperial rule opened a history book, not a Velarath history book. Those were being revised, slowly, contentiously, with the particular difficulty of institutions trying to tell true stories about themselves. A new book, one of the first written for the Galactic Council's new shared educational initiative. The chapter she opened was titled simply, "The Human War." She read for a long time. When she finished, she sat quietly for a while. Then she went to find her mother. "They were afraid," she said. "The whole time, they were afraid." Her mother looked at her. "Yes," she said. "And they did it anyway." "Yes." The child thought about this. "I want to be like that," she said. Her mother pulled her close. And outside, for the first time in 80 years, the flag above their building was not Velarath. It was theirs. This is the story of humanity, not the story of the strongest species, not the oldest, not the most advanced, not the one with the biggest ships or the deepest history, or the most certain sense of its own destiny. The story of the species that was told by something 50,000 years older and vastly more powerful, that it was insufficient, and that looked back, afraid, grieving, furious, and completely unwilling to accept the verdict, and said, "Come then." That is the story. That has always been the story. Because humanity does not win by being the best. Humanity wins by refusing, absolutely, stubbornly, at every cost, past every breaking point, to be finished. We are not the strongest. We are not the oldest. We are not the most powerful. But we are the ones who look at the dark and build lights. We are the ones who fall and get back up. We are the ones who lose everything and find something worth protecting in the ash. We are human, and the galaxy has learned not to count us out. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it made something rise in your chest, comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Was it Mars? Kepler Station? The The ghost fleet in the dark? Was it Torres and his tomatoes? Was it a 17-year-old girl saying, "Teach me"? Tell me. I want to know. If you believe in what humanity represents, not the perfect version, but the real version, the afraid and stubborn and loving and furious version, like this video. If you think someone else needs to hear this story, share it. And if you want to be here when the next story begins, subscribe and hit the bell, because there are more stories where this one came from. More worlds, more wars, more moments when something small and underestimated looked at something enormous and certain and refused. I'll see you in the next one. HFY, always, end.